In this edition of Back in History, we present to you the intricate story of Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. We present to you his birth, parentage, education, growing up years, involvement in rebellion in his country of birth, rebellion in neighboring countries, his rise to the position of Chief of Defense Staff of Uganda, his role in ending the Rwandan genocide, his eventual ascension to power as President of Rwanda, his support for the amendment of the Constitution of Rwanda to enable him take multiple terms in office, the controversies around him, his development of Rwanda, and many more. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. Paul Kagame was born on 23rd October 1957. He was born into a large family of 6 children, and he is the last child of the family. He was born in Tambo in Rwanda, Urundi, a village located in what is now the southern province of Rwanda. His father was known as Deogracias Rutagambwa. He was a member of the Tutsi ethnic group. Paul Kagame is therefore Tutsi by virtue of his birth. Paul Kagame's mother was Asteria Bisinda. Rwanda as a country has had to grapple with ethnic rivalry from time immemorial. There are 3 ethnic groups in the country, namely the Hutus, having 85% of the population, the Tutsis, having 15% of the population, and the Twa ethnic group, having only 1%. When the colonial administrators and early missionaries arrived in Rwanda, they worked more with the Tutsis and gave them leadership and administrative roles. The majority ethnic group, the Hutus, were pastoralists and engaged more in agriculture. Upon the passage of time, animosity and ethnic rivalry began to grow among the Hutus and Tutsis. Intermittently, there was the outbreak of violence among them, sometimes large-scale violence leading to the relocation of people to refugee camps. While Paul Kagame was just a young boy, there was an outbreak of violence among the 2 dominant ethnic groups, resulting in the relocation of his family from Rwanda to Uganda. Paul's story is thus not complete without the mention of his growing up years in Uganda. It was here in Uganda that he first met with a man known as Fred Rwigema, who would later become the leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, a rebel movement which would later play a significant role in the life of Paul Kagame. The young Paul Kagame began his primary education in a school near the refugee camp, where he and other Rwandan refugees learned how to speak English and began to integrate into the Ugandan culture. At the age of 9, he moved to Rwenguru Primary School. He subsequently attended the Ntare School, one of the best schools in Uganda at the time, which was also the alma mater of future Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. Paul also attended Old Kampala Secondary School for his secondary education. In Uganda, the Rwandan refugees became subject of attacks by the locals, and Paul Kagame and other Rwandans began to think out ways of defending themselves and defending their people. After completing his education, Kagame made 2 visits to Rwanda, his home country, in 1977 and 1978. There in Rwanda, he was hosted by his childhood friends and former classmates. He later got in contact with his own family. He kept a low profile on these visits, believing that his status as a well-connected Tutsi exile could lead to arrest. Kagame used his time in Rwanda to explore the country, familiarize himself with the political and social situation there, and make connections that would prove useful to him in his later activities. When he was done with his visit, he went back to Uganda. Back in Uganda, Kagame had gotten himself fully integrated with many events and familiar with most personalities in the country. At this time, the man in power in Uganda was Idi Amin. Idi Amin was later removed from power and replaced with a transitional government. Election was then conducted, and Milton Obote, who was earlier removed by Idi Amin, won the election. His victory was challenged by Yoweri Museveni. Museveni called his supporters to withdraw from Obote's government, and this was done without delay. Museveni then returned to the trenches and formed a rebel movement to fight Obote's government. The rebel movement was known as the Popular Resistance Army, PRA. He recruited fighters into the movement, and one of the persons that joined as a founding fighter was Paul Kagame. Fred Rwigema, another Rwandan, also joined as founding fighter, along with 38 Ugandans. The goal was to overthrow Obote's government in what became known as the Ugandan Bush War. Kagame fought in the war and also took part in the Battle of Kabamba in February 1981. It has been reported that Kagame and Fred Rwigema joined the Popular Resistance Army primarily to ease conditions for Rwandan refugees who had become subject of persecution by President Obote. They also had a long-term goal of returning with other Tutsi refugees to Rwanda, and to achieve this goal, they understood the fact that military experience was needed for them to be able to fight the dominant ethnic group back at home. Their involvement in rebel movement in Uganda, a foreign land, was therefore intended to prepare their arms and minds for future battles. The Popular Resistance Army eventually merged with another rebel group in June 1981, forming what is known as the National Resistance Army. In the National Resistance Army, Kagame specialized in intelligence gathering and rose to a position close to that of Museveni. Kagame and Museveni became really close, and Museveni reposed in him trust and confidence. Through much battles, Yoweri Museveni seized power in Uganda and was sworn in as the president of the country. Museveni did not forget the people that fought the battles with him. One of the first persons he appointed into his cabinet was Paul Kagame, and the fact that Paul was not from Uganda was immaterial to Museveni. Paul was smart and strong and had an eye for intelligence, and his expertise was needed by Museveni in his new government. Paul was thus appointed as the head of military intelligence. His appointment was indeed a remarkable achievement for a foreigner and a refugee. Another Rwandan, Fred Rwigema, was appointed as senior officer in the new Ugandan army. In addition to their army duties, Paul Kagame and Fred Rwigema began building a covert network of Rwandan Tutsi refugees within the army's ranks, intended as the nucleus for future attacks on Rwanda. In 1989, Rwanda's President Juvenal Habyarimana and many Ugandans in the army began to criticize Museveni over his appointment of Rwandan refugees to senior military positions. And in response to this, President Museveni demoted Paul Kagame and Fred Rwigema. Kagame and Rwigema remained senior military officers in the Ugandan army nonetheless, but without the high positions they earlier occupied. This change in their positions caused them to accelerate their plans to invade Rwanda, their country of birth, with a view to taking over and participating in the government of the country. They joined an organization called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, a refugee association which had been operating under various names since 1979. Fred Rwigema became the leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front shortly after joining, and while still working for the Ugandan army, he and Kagame completed their invasion plans. They got the men and ammunition and became ready to invade Rwanda from Uganda. In October 1990, Fred Rwigema led a force of over 4,000 RPF rebels into Rwanda at the Kagitumba border post, advancing south to the town of Gabiro. Kagame was not present at the initial raids, as he was in the United States of America attending the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, under sponsorship of the government of Uganda. On the second day of the attack, the unexpected occurred. Fred Rwigema was shot in the head and killed. This was a devastating blow to the plan to invade Rwanda. His death threw the Rwandan Patriotic Front into confusion. France and Zaire deployed forces in support of the Rwandan army, and by the end of October, the Rwandan Patriotic Front had been pushed back into the far northeast corner of the country, having suffered the devastating blow of the death of its trusted commander, Fred Rwigema. Kagame later returned to Africa from the United States of America and took command of the RPF forces, which had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 troops at the time of his arrival. He engaged the available forces in training and prepared them for a return battle in Rwanda. Kagame and his soldiers moved west through Uganda to the Virunga Mountains, a rugged high-altitude area where the terrain worked in their favor. From there, he rearmed and reorganized the army and carried out fundraising and recruitment from the Tutsis in diaspora. For Kagame, the Tutsis needed to be liberated, and the liberation was to be embarked upon despite the odds. In January 1991, Kagame restarted combat with an attack on the northern town of Ruhengeri. He employed the element of surprise in his attacks. The RPF captured the town and held it for a day before retreating back into the forest. For the next year, the RPF waged a hit-and-run guerrilla war, capturing some border areas but not making significant gains against the Rwandan army. These actions caused an exodus of around 300,000 Hutus from the affected areas. Kagame's forces continued to carry on attacks, and in a matter of time, Kagame's presence as a rebel leader became fully established. The government of the day needed peace to foster development and thus sent emissaries to engage Kagame in talks towards a ceasefire. The talks eventually yielded fruit, and in 1992 a multi-party coalition government was formed in Kigali. Kagame then announced a ceasefire and initiated negotiations with the Rwandan government in Arusha, Tanzania, towards the attainment of peace in Rwanda. In early 1993, serious attacks were launched against Kagame's tribe, the Tutsis, by persons suspected to be extremist Hutus. Kagame responded by suspending the peace talks temporarily and launching a major attack, making serious gains across the north of the country. Later on, the attacks on the Tutsis were halted, leading to the resumption of peace talks in Arusha, Tanzania. The peace talks resulted in a set of agreements known as the Arusha Accords. The said accords were signed in August 1993. This was a significant milestone in the history of Rwanda. It brought to an end the atmosphere of hostilities and violence which had defined the country for several years. For the first time in many years, the people of Rwanda were hopeful that they will still witness development and harmonious coexistence which had eluded them for so many years. Part of the agreements reached in the accords was that Kagame's RPF will be given positions to occupy in a broad-based transitional government and their members integrated into the Rwandan army. This was adhered to. This is how Paul Kagame made his inroad into the mainstream administration of the Republic of Rwanda. While Rwandans continued to enjoy the peace that was secured through years of negotiations, the unexpected occurred. The plane carrying the Rwandan president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was brought down by a rocket launcher near the Kigali airport. President Juvenal Habyarimana died in the crash along with co-passengers and the entire crew. His assassination sparked an unprecedented wave of violence in Rwanda, in what is infamously referred today as the Rwandan genocide. The president of Burundi, Cyprien Ntaryamira, was in the same plane and also died in the crash. The attackers of the plane remain unknown till today. Some analysts have stated that it was most likely a coup d'etat carried out by extreme Hutu members of Habyarimana's government who feared that the president was serious about honoring the Arusha Agreement, an action they were not ready to accept. Other analysts such as French Judge Jean-Louis and Spanish Judge Fernando Andrew alleged separately in their reports that Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front were responsible for the bringing down of the plane. Paul Kagame has since denied this allegation and has described it as untrue and unfounded. In just a matter of weeks following the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana, an estimated 800,000 people were killed, and the worst hit by the massacre were the Tutsis, Paul Kagame's people. This is how Paul Kagame went back to carry arms. He mobilized his men and fought to contend the massacre and save his people from the attacks. It has been reported that Paul Kagame played a significant role in bringing the genocide to an end. At this time, scores of lives had been lost and properties destroyed, and the country once again became deeply polarized. But what was remarkable was the ending of the carnage. It is worthy of note that following President Juvenal Habyarimana's death, a military committee led by Colonel Bagosora took immediate control of the country. It was during the reign of this committee that the genocide occurred. Kagame waged war against the interim committee and accused them of perpetuating the genocide. Kagame then set out to fight the regime. There were several attempts to broker a ceasefire, but Kagame ignored the attempts and fought on to end the genocide. Kagame and his group were also interested in taking over the reins of power in Rwanda. As of June 1994, the interim government was forced to relocate to Gisenyi in the northwest of Rwanda. The genocide eventually ended, and at this time, Colonel Bagosora was no more in power. A new government was thus required to pilot the affairs of the country. The post-genocide Rwandan government took office in Kigali in July 1994. It was based loosely on the Arusha Accords. A new president emerged in the person of Pasteur Bizimungu. Paul Kagame became the vice president and doubled as Minister of Defense. While Pasteur Bizimungu was Hutu by tribe, Paul Kagame was Tutsi. Pasteur Bizimungu had worked as a civil servant under Habyarimana, the immediate past president of the country, who was brought down in a plane crash. President Pasteur Bizimungu and his cabinet had control over a number of domestic issues, but Kagame remained the commander-in-chief of the army and was in fact the de facto ruler of the country. Bizimungu was merely seen by many as a placeholder for Kagame. Kagame was the man who pulled the shots in the country, even as vice president. He was a very powerful man who wielded so much influence. Many people knew that Kagame was just marking time to move into the office of president. It was just a matter of time. He also needed to be tactical about his ambition and to first gain grounds, friendship, and the confidence of many. Beginning from 1994, Kagame began to disagree publicly with President Pasteur Bizimungu. Kagame accused Bizimungu of corruption and poor management, while Bizimungu felt that he had no power over appointment to the cabinet and that the Transitional National Assembly was acting purely as a puppet for Kagame. Bizimungu resigned from the presidency in March 2000. Some analysts believe that Bizimungu was forced into resignation by Kagame. Following Bizimungu's resignation, the Supreme Court ruled that Kagame should become acting president until a permanent successor was chosen. Kagame remained in office as acting president for a short while, and in April 2000, he emerged as the president, having been elected by the College of Ministers. He was sworn into office and has been in office as president up to the time of the making of this video. Since ascending to the presidency in 2000, Kagame has faced 3 presidential elections in 2003, 2010, and 2017. Each term is for 7 years. On each occasion, he was re-elected in a landslide, winning more than 90% of the votes. A constitutional amendment referendum in 2015, which gave Kagame the ability to stand for additional terms, also passed by similar margins. International election monitors, human rights organizations, and journalists generally regard these elections as lacking in credibility, freedom, and fairness, with interventions by the Rwandan state to ensure Kagame's victory. Kagame has, however, dismissed these statements and has maintained that his presidency is a product of the overwhelming support and love of his people who troop out en masse to cast their votes for him. Paul Kagame is seen by many as the man who is fully in charge. Kagame began actively planning methods to achieve national development. He launched a national consultation process and also sought the advice of experts from emerging nations, including China, Singapore, and Thailand. Following these consultations, and shortly after assuming the presidency, Kagame launched an ambitious program of national development called Vision 2020. The major purposes of the program were to unite Rwandan people and to transform Rwanda from a highly impoverished country into a middle-income country. The program consists of a list of goals which the government aimed to achieve before the year 2020, and so much of these goals had since been achieved. These include reconstruction, infrastructure, and transport improvements, good governance, improving agriculture production, private sector development, and health and educational improvements. Kagame has made education for youth in Rwanda a high priority for his administration, allocating 17% of the annual budget to the sector. The Rwandan government provides free education in state-run schools for 12 years, 6 years in primary and 6 years in secondary school. The final 3 years of free education were introduced in 2012 following a pledge made by Kagame during his 2010 re-election campaign. Kagame credits his government with improvements in the tertiary educational sector. The number of universities has risen from 1 in 1994 to 29 in 2010, and the tertiary gross enrollment ratio increased from 4% in 2008 to 7% in 2011. From 1994 until 2009, secondary education was offered in either French or English. Due to the country's increasing ties with the East African community and the Commonwealth of Nations, English has been the sole language of instruction in public schools from primary school, grade 4, onward. Paul is still seen by many as a controversial figure who has sponsored rebellion in neighboring countries such as the DR Congo, where he assisted the Laurent Kabila's forces in the armed struggle that resulted in the emergence of Laurent Kabila as the president of the country. But the overall opinion on the regime of Paul Kagame by foreign observers is mixed. Several persons across Africa and the world have commended him for the transformation of Rwanda and its regeneration from the ashes of the genocide to where it is today. Others see him as high-handed. As president, Kagame has prioritized national development, launching programs which have led to development on key indicators including healthcare, education, and economic growth. Paul Kagame is seen by many as the man in charge. A former rebel leader, he allows no room for rebellion in his country. President Paul Kagame is married to Janet Nyiramongi, a Tutsi exile who lived in Nairobi, Kenya. They got married in 1989 and together they have 4 children. Paul Kagame is highly respected by many and also hated by many, but he remains a towering figure in Africa till today. Kagame is indeed a man of many parts. He is a man who has fought many battles in his life. He grew up in a refugee camp and saw the most challenging circumstances while growing up. He then took to arms to protect himself and protect his people at the refugee camp and later grew to become a rebel leader. He took active part in the removal of the president of another country, Uganda, and the installation of a new president of the country. He served as the Minister of Defense of a foreign country, and when the time came, he became the president of his own country. Paul has been the man in charge of Rwanda for close to 3 decades now, since his entry into governance in 1994 as vice president. Several persons have accused him of holding on to power for too long and thus becoming a sit-tight leader, a phenomenon common to most African leaders. But for others, Paul Kagame's long stay in power has engendered consistency and development in Rwanda when compared to other countries in the African continent. Whatever may be the most appropriate perspective and assessment of the leadership of Paul Kagame, the fact remains that Rwanda has in the last number of years become the toast and envy of many countries and great personalities across the continent of Africa and the world. Its ability to regenerate itself from the ashes of the genocide and move into transformational development has been well commended by many across the globe. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to this channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I remain your friend and host, Kagame, wishing you the best of time as you walk with me on this mission to discover and make appropriate documentation of the history of Africa.